Okay, I'm glad it's a conversation, and I'm sure different ideas will emerge. I'll begin by saying I'm interested in making pieces of city, making buildings that work for all kinds of people, and in different kinds of way. That's a book I produced not long ago called Extraordinary. So in a sense, to me, as a designer of pieces of cities, which include buildings that might be tall, it's a kind of interesting debate about, is it a different mindset when we go tall, and what is tall? There's clearly the kind of, this is obviously tall and horizontal, which is obviously the ultimate ambition as achieved by Rem Koolhaas somewhere else. But this is Porto. There is an idea about tall and the shock of the new, although once was an idea about tall and the shock of the new, particularly in a place like America when skyscrapers were being invented. And of course, an early skyscraper, I was in St. Louis recently, is 12 stories. So what's tall? Well, tall is different to each generation. And the debate, I suppose, about tall buildings is, why are they different to other buildings? Well, I think they have a responsibility at the ground in a different way to other buildings because they take more of the sky. I think they have to be more generous at the ground. That, to me, is one of the rules. In a cynical way, it's one of the rules of negotiation in the planning situation. But in another way, it is a real rule. If you're taking sky, I think you have to start thinking about the ground and what you might give back. They're very political and charged, and politics and architecture can't be kind of separated. I show this project. It's not a tall building, although it was a shock when it was built. It was the Casa del Fascio in Como by Giuseppe Terrani. After the war, it was renamed the Casa del Popolo. What that raises to me is a difference between the idea of a building and the idea of what goes on in the building. Can you separate them out? And again, in tall buildings, that becomes a debate. It's just an office building consuming our sky. To me, I would argue that tall buildings, whether office or residential, consume our sky. Both programs are relevant for cities, so we need to think about that when we're justifying, in my case, why we might go tall. Tall buildings probably demand a greater idea. Louis Sullivan said they're just a whole lot of floors. He obviously spent his career ensuring that they weren't a whole lot of floors. How do we determine the height? Well, planners will have a view, we'll have a view. There's an issue about tall and floor to floor, because too often people are told you can only go so high, so we spend the entire kind of British construction industry expertise squeezing an extra floor in, which doesn't seem to be a particularly creative act. But I think tall buildings actually are often, their height is determined by lifting strategies. We did one of 90 meters in Southwark, which we all think could have gone taller now, because everything else around is taller, but at the time it was tall. But actually, if we'd gone taller, we'd have to go to 135. That was the next natural jump. So there are certain rules we don't really think of determining height, practical rules. Can tall buildings be every day in the city? I think they can in certain cities. You know, an idea of height. In London, we might think of a 6 or 7 story city. In certain kind of other global cities, you might think of a 18, 20 story building. I certainly know in parts of the Far East where 8's are lucky numbers, buildings are 8 story, 18 or 88. What they do is kind of important, what they house. Now, someone said to me recently, I don't know if it's true, but it's that idea about repeating someone else's facts and statistics. Apart from 9/11, only 4 buildings over 150 meters have ever been taken down because commercially it's incredibly difficult when you have that much real estate in the sky to actually dismantle it and build something else. You cannot justify the void. If it's residential, it's probably even more permanent. If it's commercial, it's slightly less permanent. So it's not just, is a building tall, is a building of a particular program, and is that program going to dictate its lifestyle, its life cycle, which to me suggests that tall buildings do have a greater responsibility to be sustainable, both in terms of how they work in the city, but also in terms of their potential longevity. If they can't be taken down because they're sold to people, or they can't be taken down because they're economically not viable to take them down, those buildings need to be more robust. They need to fulfill those long life, loose fit, low energy criteria. So in many ways, you could argue that a specific function for a tall building is inappropriate. You shouldn't design a residential or a commercial tall building. You should design a tall building that might well last 150 or more years. In tall buildings, there's a social challenge. I'm a child of the 60s, and I was always told people lived in towers and were isolated and disconnected. And that was Trellick Tower when I was young. Trellick Tower then became very fashionable and popular and successful. So that's, was that a myth, or have cultures changed? Do we have to learn how to live with and enjoy tall buildings? They need to make rooms and be generous in the city. And of course, therefore, I kind of lead to the idea that a really good tall building is about how it takes up the sky, because most people never visit any building they see, but more people will see a tall building. Therefore, that tall building has a greater responsibility to offer some visual and aesthetic pleasure in the city. It has a greater responsibility to absorb change over time. It has a greater responsibility to be designed in an intelligent and sustainable way in terms of its material components and structure. To me, that's an idea about life cycle. It's an idea that the building is the theatre of life, and actually what we're doing, whether that's work or education or living, is kind of irrelevant. A tall building, if it's going to last, as is likely to be the case, needs to last for many different uses we don't yet know. This is the big skyline debate. I'm sure Barbara will talk about that. We have a view from our office where the clusters look like a mess. Another word could be added to the word cluster. This kind of tells you a story about desperate attempts to be different, the problem of slenderness ratios. Everyone wants 8 flats around a core, so is a dumpy 18-story building better than a 28-story building? Perhaps to me, it's about not height, but it's about slenderness ratios, which is why no one has problems with church spires, because they don't accommodate 8 apartments and a lift core. This is New York, where tall is different again. Tall there is probably a shoulder height is 25, 30 stories, a mid-rise block is 50, and it's only the blocks, at 300, 400 that begin, to kind of emerge. So we might be in a world where London is changing its idea of shoulder heights and height. I end with this, because this is the great other debate we're brought up with, which is density. Can tall buildings solve the density crisis? Well, again, I was brought up with the idea that for every tower block and the gang mode lawn around it, you could actually have built low-rise housing with streets and everyone would have been happy. And that's a very relevant criticism. And I show this because it's an idea of very, very dense living, which its space, an Italian hill town, or anonymous Italian hill town, its space and overlooking standards would be completely unacceptable to us. It would all be blighted by our rules. But is it better in that town to be dense, low-rise, and kind of overlooked and overshadowed? Or is it better for that town to kind of absorb a series of towers? What's interesting to me in the great debate, in this conversation, is this is an anonymous hill town. This is San Gimignano, a UNESCO World Heritage site. So maybe we could kind of flip the whole thing around, and maybe we just need to think about longevity and the quality of what we build. And actually, the debate isn't about the skyline, it's about the quality of the buildings. Thank you.